In this episode, we are looking at something that helps security work become more consistent, more defensible, and much easier to explain to leadership, auditors, and operations teams. Industry frameworks for vulnerability management give organizations a shared way to think about how they identify weaknesses, assess their importance, respond to them, and keep improving over time instead of reacting in a scattered or improvised way. For a beginner, a framework is best understood as a structured guide that helps people organize security work into repeatable practices rather than random one-off actions. Vulnerability management by itself can easily become a flood of scan results, conflicting priorities, and endless remediation requests, but a framework helps turn that flood into a manageable process with clear expectations. The value of learning these frameworks is not that you will memorize every detail of every model, but that you will begin to understand how mature organizations create order, accountability, and decision-making discipline around a problem that could otherwise become chaotic very quickly. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is to understand why frameworks matter at all. Many people assume vulnerability management simply means running a scanner, collecting a list of findings, and telling someone to patch the systems that look weak. That approach sounds simple, but in a real organization it falls apart quickly because not every weakness carries the same risk, not every asset has the same value, and not every system can be changed on the same timeline or in the same way. Frameworks exist to provide structure around those realities so that security teams do not rely only on instinct, vendor defaults, or whichever administrator happens to speak the loudest in a meeting. A framework helps define how vulnerabilities are discovered, how they are validated, how they are prioritized, how remediation is tracked, how exceptions are handled, and how results are measured over time. In other words, the framework turns vulnerability work from a purely technical activity into a repeatable management process that supports better outcomes across the whole organization. One important idea for new learners is that a framework is not the same thing as a tool. A tool can scan a network, inspect a system, report a missing patch, or compare a host against known weakness patterns. But the tool by itself does not decide what the organization should care about first, how fast a response should happen, or how different teams should coordinate when the fix affects business operations. A framework gives those activities a logical home and helps define how the pieces connect to each other. It can guide who owns the assets, who approves exceptions, how risk is communicated, and how leadership judges whether the program is improving or stagnating. Without that structure, organizations often end up with large numbers of findings and very little consistent follow-through. This is why strong defenders learn to look past the scan report and ask whether the organization has a real operating model for vulnerability management, because the operating model is what determines whether findings become action or simply remain data in a dashboard. Many frameworks touch vulnerability management even when they were not created solely for that purpose. Some provide broad cybersecurity guidance, some focus on control selection and governance, some emphasize secure configuration and hardening, and others help with incident handling, measurement, or risk communication. For a beginner, it is helpful to stop thinking of frameworks as isolated rulebooks and instead see them as lenses that highlight different parts of the same challenge. One framework may explain how security functions should be organized across an enterprise, while another may help define technical baselines, and another may help teams think about threat-informed prioritization and resilience. When organizations combine these perspectives thoughtfully, they gain a more complete vulnerability management capability than they would from any single source alone. That is why a CySA Plus learner should care about the topic. The goal is not to worship a framework name. The goal is to understand how frameworks help teams build repeatable, accountable, and risk-aware security programs. One of the most influential sources in this space is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which provides guidance that many organizations use to shape their security programs. NIST is important because it does not treat cybersecurity as a collection of isolated technical tricks. Instead, It places activities like vulnerability identification, protective controls, detection, response, and recovery into a broader management context that helps organizations see how all the parts support each other. For vulnerability management, that is useful because it encourages teams to think beyond simply finding flaws and to consider how vulnerabilities relate to asset management, configuration control, monitoring, response planning, and organizational governance. A weakness that appears on a scan report is only one piece of the picture, and NIST helps organizations connect that piece to a wider system of risk management and operational discipline. For a beginner, the key lesson is that vulnerability work becomes much stronger when it is tied to an overall security strategy rather than treated as a separate technical chore performed in isolation. Another commonly used source of practical guidance comes from the Center for Internet Security, CIS, which is well known for helping organizations translate security ideas into clear operational priorities. CIS is especially helpful for beginners because it often feels concrete and action-oriented rather than overly abstract. In vulnerability management, that matters because teams need more than philosophy. They need a way to think about asset inventory, secure configuration, continuous assessment, control validation, and the reduction of obvious weaknesses that attackers routinely exploit. CIS guidance helps reinforce the idea that vulnerability management is not only about chasing dramatic zero-day scenarios. It is also about doing foundational work well, such as knowing what systems exist, hardening them consistently, reducing unnecessary exposure, and checking them regularly for weakness and drift. That focus is valuable because strong security programs are often built on disciplined fundamentals rather than on flashy tools or one-time cleanup projects. The International Organization for Standardization, ISO, also plays a role in how many organizations think about vulnerability management, particularly through security management standards that emphasize governance, policy, control selection, review, and continual improvement. ISO is useful because it frames security not just as a technical discipline, but as a management system that should be documented, reviewed, assigned to responsible owners, and improved over time. That way of thinking matters in vulnerability management because even excellent technical findings produce weak outcomes if there is no formal process for ownership, remediation tracking, exception approval, or performance measurement. In an ISO-influenced environment, the question is not only whether vulnerabilities exist. The question is whether the organization has a structured and auditable way to identify them, assess their impact, assign corrective action, and verify that the process is actually functioning. For a beginner, this reinforces the reality that mature security programs succeed through discipline and repeatability, not only through technical skill. Frameworks are also valuable because they help normalize the life cycle of vulnerability management. A good program does not end when a scan finishes. It moves through discovery, validation, prioritization, remediation, verification, reporting, and refinement. And frameworks help organizations understand that these are linked parts of one process rather than disconnected tasks owned by different teams who barely talk to each other. If discovery is strong but validation is poor, analysts may chase false positives. If prioritization is weak, high-risk issues may wait, while trivial findings consume time. If remediation is untracked, the same problems will return month after month. If verification is missing, leadership may believe the risk has been reduced when it actually remains. Framework thinking helps security teams avoid these traps by making the entire lifecycle visible and manageable. For CySA Plus learners, that mindset is important because the analyst role often depends on understanding not just how to find weaknesses, but how weaknesses move through the organization from identification to resolution. Another major benefit of frameworks is that they create a common language between technical teams and business leadership. Security analysts often think in terms of ports, services, configurations, exposures, weaknesses, and exploit paths, while executives and managers tend to think in terms of business disruption, customer impact, legal exposure, service continuity, and accountability. Frameworks help translate between those worlds because they place technical findings inside broader categories such as risk treatment, governance, control effectiveness, resilience, and program maturity. That translation matters because vulnerability management needs resources, cooperation, and sometimes difficult business decisions, especially when remediation is disruptive or expensive. If analysts cannot explain why a weakness matters in a framework the business understands, the finding may not get the attention it deserves. A structured model helps everyone discuss the problem using shared expectations rather than competing assumptions, and that makes security decisions more consistent. In practice, this is one of the quiet strengths of frameworks. They are not only about technical correctness, they are also about organizational alignment. It is also important to understand that frameworks do not remove the need for judgment. A beginner might hope that once an organization adopts a respected model, the correct answer to every vulnerability decision will become obvious and automatic. Real environments do not work that way. Frameworks provide structure, but people still have to decide how to classify assets, how to interpret threat context, how to weigh exploitability against business dependence, how to sequence remediation, and when a compensating control is strong enough to justify delay. Two organizations may use the same framework and still make different decisions because their technology, risk tolerance, regulatory obligations, and operational constraints are not identical. That does not mean frameworks are weak. It means they are guides rather than substitutes for analysis. Strong analysts learn to use frameworks as disciplined support for decision-making, not as rigid excuses to avoid thinking critically about what the environment actually needs. One especially useful concept that frameworks reinforce is prioritization by context rather than by volume alone. In a large environment, thousands of vulnerabilities may be discovered across systems, applications, cloud resources, and supporting infrastructure, and no organization can realistically treat every finding as equally urgent. Frameworks help teams organize that problem by encouraging risk-based thinking. A weakness on a highly exposed server that supports a critical business service may deserve much faster attention than a technically similar weakness on a low-value isolated system. A missing patch may look severe in a generic list, but if compensating controls limit exposure, the practical urgency may differ. On the other hand, a weakness with a modest score may deserve urgent review if it sits on a sensitive asset with broad access to important data. Frameworks help analysts avoid shallow prioritization models by reminding them that vulnerability management is about risk reduction, not just about counting findings or sorting by whatever number appears first in a scanner report. The Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, is often part of this discussion because it gives organizations a standardized way to describe and compare the technical severity of many known vulnerabilities. CVSS is helpful because it brings consistency to severity communication, and that can make large volumes of findings easier to organize. At the same time, a mature framework-driven program understands that CVSS is only one input into prioritization rather than the final answer. A high CVSS score does not automatically mean the organization faces the highest real-world risk, and a moderate score does not automatically mean the issue can wait safely. Asset value, exposure, exploit activity, business role, compensating controls, and operational consequence all matter too. This is why frameworks are so important. They help security teams place technical scoring inside a broader decision process instead of mistaking score values for complete risk judgments. Beginners who understand this early avoid one of the most common weaknesses in immature vulnerability programs, which is assuming that severity numbers alone can drive all meaningful decisions. Frameworks also support continuous improvement, which is one of the clearest differences between a mature program and a reactive one. A reactive team may scan, scramble, patch what feels urgent, and then move on until the next wave of findings appears. A framework-oriented team asks additional questions. Are the same asset classes producing the same weaknesses repeatedly? Are baseline controls failing in deployment? Are certain business units not remediating on time? Are exception requests increasing because the process is unrealistic? Are visibility gaps preventing accurate reporting? Those questions matter because vulnerability management should not only reduce individual findings. It should also reduce the conditions that keep generating those findings. Frameworks encourage teams to measure trends, review effectiveness, improve ownership, and strengthen preventive controls so that the program becomes more efficient over time. That longer view is essential because organizations do not become more secure by repeatedly processing the same problems forever without changing the underlying causes. For someone preparing for CySA+, the best way to understand industry frameworks for vulnerability management is to see them as structures that help security teams move from technical detection to organized risk reduction. They help define responsibilities, create shared language, shape prioritization, support communication, and keep the process from collapsing into a noisy stream of disconnected findings. NIST, CIS, ISO, and scoring models like CVSS each contribute something useful, but none of them replaces the need for thoughtful analysis and sound operational judgment. Their real strength is that they help organizations create repeatable practices that can survive personnel changes, scale across large environments, and stand up to scrutiny from leadership, auditors, and regulators. When a framework is used well, vulnerability management becomes more predictable, more measurable, and more aligned with actual business risk. That is what makes frameworks so valuable. They are not just industry vocabulary. They are part of how serious organizations turn security intentions into disciplined action. The main takeaway is that industry frameworks for vulnerability management provide the structure that helps organizations find weaknesses, interpret them sensibly, act on them consistently, and improve their security posture over time. Without frameworks, vulnerability work often becomes fragmented, tool-driven, and difficult to align with business priorities. With frameworks, the organization gains a clearer life cycle, stronger accountability, better communication, and a more defensible way to make difficult security decisions. That does not mean a framework solves every problem automatically, but it does mean teams are far less likely to drift into chaos or rely on inconsistent judgment from one situation to the next. Once you understand the role these frameworks play, you can begin to see vulnerability management not as a never-ending pile of scan results, but as a structured discipline that helps organizations reduce real risk in a deliberate and sustainable way. That shift in perspective is one of the most important steps in thinking like an analyst rather than simply reacting like a tool operator.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.